Good morning, everyone. All right. Well, I expected a small class this morning. I was doing the math in my head and thinking we've got quite a few people out of town. But we're glad that you're here. Hope you're ready to engage in our study. Lesson number 1 of this new quarter, continuing on in our study of the Old Testament, studying through the Bible in 3.5 or 4 years. We're moving into a new time period today, and that's the wandering in the wilderness. And if you're like the kids downstairs, they feel like, haven't we already been wandering in the wilderness? And it's like, tried to clarify to them, no, we didn't make that transition into that period of Bible history yet, because just last week, in our study last week, they refused to go in to the Promised Land. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. But there's a lot of great content in this first lesson. Hopefully we'll have time to get to all of that. So I have my Bible open to Numbers 14. Today's lesson will start at the end of chapter 15 and goes through the beginning of chapter 18. I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of where we're headed this quarter. So we've got 13 weeks as usual, and we are in the book of Numbers. At the end of the book of Numbers, we're going to spend quite a bit of time in the book of Deuteronomy, and then we're going to actually get into the book of Joshua by the end of the quarter. So this is a study of the wandering in the wilderness. We're going to be real heavy on kind of stories and moving the story forward in the book of Numbers these first 4 weeks. And then, like I said, we're going to spend about 7 or 8 weeks studying the book of Deuteronomy. Probably not, as parts of the Bible go, where we spend a lot of time, this is probably the part of the Bible where we spend the least, really studying the book of Numbers. It's easy to feel like, yeah, what's the book of Numbers about? Yeah, it must be when they counted the people, right? Well, there's a lot of content in there and stories about this time. Book of Deuteronomy, that's Moses' retelling of the law to a new generation. And we'll spend time. I consider it a blessing that we have so much time to spend on these chapters of such an important book, rather than just assuming, okay, we've covered that and let's move on to the next part of the history. They stop there right before going into the Promised Land, and we get to hear and study these speeches of Moses. So that'll be a little bit more content related to doctrine and law, as you would expect in the second telling of the law, and less about this event and that event. But we do get into Joshua because that period of conquest doesn't begin until about chapter 6 of Joshua. So it's the end of their journey in Joshua chapters 1 through 5. Just a little more overview of kind of where we are. Like I said, we're starting this wandering in the wilderness period, and everybody knows about how long that was, because we've memorized that since we were little. That's 40 years. But when you think about, like I said, the kids were kind of confused at times because it feels like we've been in the wilderness for a while. But last quarter, where was Israel for the most part of last quarter? Where were they?
They were at Mount Sinai.
And they had, of course, left Egypt, but they were going where God instructed them to go. That period of time, Brother Waldron helped us understand, was about 1.5 years since they had left Egypt, since that Passover night when they fled from Pharaoh. So this period of time is 40 years, so it's the bigger chunk of time. And then when they go in and invade the land, that conquest is only going to take about 6 years. So this is you might think, a long period of time that we're going to cover in this quarter. We're going to cover the wilderness wandering. However, we don't have a lot of information about what happens during that time. In fact, if you remember back to 3 cycle, and I didn't pull it in the list, I might do that next week, the list of things to remember about the wilderness wandering is quite long. But as I went through our lessons and what we're going to study week after week, almost all of those events are going to take place this week and next week in our studies. And then we're going to spend most of our time, like I said, studying in the book of Deuteronomy. In fact, the first 39 years of the wilderness wandering, all the stories that we have from those first 39 years are in this week's lesson. And so there's a couple of small stories. We'll mention the man who died on the Sabbath day and the tassels that they were told to put on their clothing. But then you have this major story in today's lesson of Korah's rebellion. That's the major story from this first 39 years. Brother Waldron brings this out. It wasn't obvious to me that, from the time you get the story of Miriam's death and onward, that's all happening in that final year, right before they're ready to go enter into the promised land, where they now start moving into position to enter, crossing the Jordan. So lessons 2 through 12 are all in that final year. That's not uncommon in our Bibles, though, right? Can you think of some other times where, God kind of skips forward in the story? Sam?
Maybe the first thing that comes to mind is, I think Jesse made a point in our Luke study that we get maybe halfway through it, and you see that's when Jesus and his disciples are entering into the city, and he's saying, like, this is where the Son of Man is going to be crucified. It's kind of like, well, these are the final events of Jesus' life. And the first half is, and that's the first thing I think of.
Yeah, I thought Jesus' life
Too. We don't get much from his birth until he's 12. You get a snapshot, and then he's ready to start his ministry, and he's 30 years old. Yeah. But there's quite a few times. We've got to remember the Bible is full of history, but it's the intent of the writers, the intent of the Holy Spirit was not to give a detailed account of what happened every year, every month of every year. It's purposeful. He's giving you the events to lead to a conclusion, to lead you to obviously pointing toward Christ, as we pointed out all along. All right. So, just by way of a quick review, I gave you question 1, which was a nice, easy one. Nice, easy question to get you started. Why did God cause his people to wander in the wilderness for 40 years?
Francis?
To punish the people a year for every day the spies were gone. The punishment was for the lack of faith in God. The 10 spies did not believe, and they could not conquer the land. And the results was for every soldier would die that was counted in the census.
All right.
Very good. You covered a lot of ground there. So it's a good detail to remember. Why was it 40 years? He picked 40 years because of 40 days, right? 40 days in the land that the spies were in the land searching it out. He wanted them to remember this is about what happened with the spies. It's what happened there. And your point, I think you used the word punishment, right? They were being punished. This is where, sadly, a bad Bible student or a person who's just frankly against God and looking for ways to mock the Lord, they like to mock this part of the Bible. Because here's an example. Suddenly I'm not advancing. Okay, there it goes. Here's an example from Reddit, which is a website where people go to show how smart they are, and for everybody to read it and give them thumbs ups. They mapped from Cairo to Jerusalem using Google Maps. They said if Moses had Google Maps, it would have taken the Israeli tribe only 6 days to walk from Cairo to Jerusalem instead of 40 years. True? Yeah, it's true. I guess you could follow that trail through the desert and make it all the way to Jerusalem, not even the southern part of the land, which would count as entering the promised land, in just 6 days, 148 hours, 727 kilometers, you could have made it. And boy, you should see the comment thread on this post, talking about how stupid they were, or that this was just a myth, didn't happen, right? The Bible just telling stories that don't make any sense. Couldn't they have just sent out scouts in every direction and one of them would have found it? Comments such as this, or blasphemous, horrible comments about how horrible God was to have done this to his people when it was such a short walk. Well, that person's actually getting a little closer to the truth because, yeah, God did this. That's what the casual Bible student who hasn't read what actually happened is missing. Why were they out there for 40 years? For punishment. Even the first, we said they've been gone from Egypt how long? Year and a half? What were they doing most of that time?
Wishing they were back.
Well, true.
This rebellious generation was grumbling most of that time, but they were at Mount Sinai. Moses was up on the mountain over a month, and then the golden calf event, and he was up on the mountain another over a month, 40 days. And then he comes down with all these instructions. He's going to tell them what to do to build the tabernacle. They're going to build it. They're going to set it up. They're doing a lot of things. They're becoming that great nation that God wanted them to become. So it's not that they just were trying to get there but couldn't get there. And then the 40 years, what's God essentially doing during that time? What's his purpose? He's waiting for what?
For that generation to pass.
Waiting for them to die. He's waiting for their corpses to fall in the wilderness. This was a punishment. Remember, right at the end of last week's lesson, they tried to go in. After God says, you're not going in, they said, yeah, no, we want to go in. We'll do it now. We'll be faithful now, God. And he said, they better not. I'm not going to be with them. And they were repulsed, and they were then told to wander in the wilderness. So that's not even the Exodus route, by the way. This excludes their trip down to Mount Sinai at the bottom of this peninsula. This is a great map that we have to look at, and this is a little closer look. Of course, they've spent their time down at Mount Sinai, and then they headed up this way, and it was this path here that the spies followed, but then they are sent into the wilderness to wander for 40 years. One of the chapters that we'll get to on a later lesson, Moses lists all the places that Israel camped, basically from Egypt all the way until when they finally go into the promised land here just north of the Dead Sea. And it's an interesting list. There's a lot of places that we just don't know where these places were, but it's neat to see that Moses kind of took, of course, through the Spirit, took care to note everywhere that they went. And they went just wherever the pillar of fire or the cloud led them. And so God chooses to give us a couple of stories from this time period. So let's talk about a few of those. In Numbers 15, you get a very short story about a man who was picking up sticks on the Sabbath day. And I wanted you to notice in that story, of course, the people asked Moses because they weren't sure what are we supposed to do here. They asked Moses and they inquire of the Lord, and the Lord tells them what?
Stone with stones.
Right? He needs to be put to death. So I wanted you to notice just right before that in Numbers 15, it talks about two types of sin. What are the two types of sin that are detailed there?
And the differences between
Unintentional sin and then a presumptuous sin.
Yeah, okay, so yours says presumptuous. That's from verse 30. Does anybody have a different word in verse 30 of Numbers 15?
Yeah, that's what it says in the New American Standard.
If the person does anything defiantly. And so what's the difference? If a person sins unintentionally, what should they do?
There's a
Sin offering for that. That's how you atone for your sins. But a person who sins defiantly must be cut off. Cut off from his people. And that wasn't just, okay, you can't hang out with us anymore. No, that was euphemistically the idea that they are to be put to death. And so you see this example right after that command of a person who is put to death, which implies to us that this was defiant sin, right? He knew the law. The law was you don't work on the Sabbath day, and he went out and worked on the Sabbath day anyway. And there's a great lesson in that for us. What does that show us about God?
Means what he says.
Yeah, he is serious, right? I think Jude touched on that in the lesson about God's wrath, that we should understand the kindness and the severity of God. What else do you see?
Because a person sins, they don't automatically die.
Yeah.
Depends on what their attitude and heart were in the matter.
Yeah, great point. He looks at the heart. And so we serve a just God. He's not just a tyrant who, I got my list of rules, and even though you didn't know what you were supposed to do, you're dead. No, this very plain statement, even in the old law, which we see as, maybe we don't see God's mercy quite as much as we do very plainly when we see the new law in Christ. But no, God is the same God back then. And he understands that if you sin unintentionally, well, there's a sacrifice for sin. And so that's good for us to understand about God. He then gives us instructions, or gave his people instructions about putting tassels on their garments. So why did he want them to put tassels on their garments?
So they'll remember all his commandments.
Sorry?
They'll remember all his commandments.
They'll remember. So what were the tassels? How did they help you remember? It's a cord of blue, so it's not exactly. I was also thinking about the phylacteries that he also recommends later, which do have text on them, right? These are more just the cords or the garments. It's almost like a reminder, like I'm going to see this cord of blue, kind of like tying a string around your finger. I don't know if anyone does that anymore, but I remember that as a kid. It's just like, oh, tie this string around your finger, and then later you'll remember when you see that you needed to do something. But this was going to be to remind them that they needed to obey God. So I wanted you to consider, should we do that? Should we do likewise or something similar?
To keep reminders before us that are helpful. Might be, scripture in our homes or different things that we can set before us. But not specifically tassels necessarily. Just
Will a cord of blue help you remember to obey God? If so, sure. But I think those are good examples. Reminders. We are people just like they were. We are fickle, frail, weak-minded, easily distracted. Chase that squirrel or shiny penny, right, and forget that we need to be serving God. And so these reminders are good. So April mentioned maybe putting scripture on the wall in your home, right? Something to remind you. I always notice sometimes you get busy through the day, but you never forget to eat. And if you have a routine that we're going to pray before we eat, that may be the trigger that I need to stop and pause and consider God, right? It's not just, got to give thanks for that food so then I can eat it. It's take a moment and pray to God, and pray with your heart, your whole heart, not just a quick blessing so that we can move on. So these little automatic things maybe, and we need more than that, right? We need better habits and routines, like when I get up in the morning, before I go to sleep, different things to help us to remember God. Maybe it's a time where I'm going to study my Bible. When that time of day comes, I'm going to do it. Little reminders. We put reminders in our phone to do what we think is important. Maybe we can remind ourselves to study God's Word. So that's just interesting that God commanded that. Look at the very end of Numbers 15. He says, to do this so that you may remember to do all my commandments and be holy to your God. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt to be your God. I am Jehovah your God. His holiness is the reason. And we've got to remember who it is that we serve. This is not just that man upstairs, right? Or this friend that we might treat with casual disrespect. No, He is holy. He is Jehovah our God, and we should remember Him. So chapter 16, we get this story about Korah and Dathan and Abiram. I'll be honest, before we started doing this 3-cycle stuff, I never knew Dathan and Abiram. I never committed those names to memory. But it's Korah, Dathan, Abiram. There's a fourth one, verse 1, On, the son of Peleth. And then there's actually quite a few more who join in this rebellion. 250 men who come before the Lord and join in this rebellion, who end up suffering the consequences for their rebellion. So I want to talk about rebellion today and understand this theme, because it's a theme that certainly exists today, certainly was included in our New Testaments and talked about a little bit there. What attitudes are demonstrated by Korah and his cohorts in their rebellion?
Francis is awake.
They were jealous and they were ungrateful.
They were jealous, ungrateful,
Okay.
Authority.
Disrespect for authority. Sam?
They were proud and thinking that they were, what is used? Said all the congregation are holy, like they're elevating themselves.
Yeah,
You see their statements in verse 3. They assembled together against Moses and Aaron and said to them, "You have gone far enough, for all the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is in their midst. So why do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" So you see jealousy. Why do you think, you should be in charge? Did they put themselves in charge? No. Moses is going to be called the meekest man in all the earth. Did he want this assignment? Go back to the burning bush? Didn't really want it, but he certainly didn't exalt himself to this position. And neither did Aaron. He was given this job. He was selected by God. It's funny, when people want to rebel against a leader, a lot of times they'll throw that same accusation out. You exalted yourself to this position. And that oftentimes is not true at all. The jealousy and also the pride that Sam mentioned, right? All the congregation is holy. The Lord's in our midst, right? We're just as great as you, as if greatness is the requirement for this role of leadership, servant leadership that we see so well from Moses and from Aaron. What else do you see from their statements?
Anything else?
They're extraordinarily short-sighted, and this is something that's evident among all of these people. And it's kind of something for us to keep in our mind. They were so focused on themselves, their selfishness, and the here and now, that they were absolutely disregarding things that had just occurred, such as when Miriam and Aaron had tried this very thing just a few months ago. And God definitively said, that one.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That one is my leader. That's the one you will follow. And here they are. This is not very far away. This is like within a year.
Do we know that?
I was going to say the opposite, that we don't know when this was. Sorry, and I may have missed it. I don't think we know the when, as far as when this was in the 40 years. That one we may know. I think Brother Waldron just mentioned we don't know quite when this falls, but we can check on that. But I think whether it's time that has elapsed and they've forgotten that you shouldn't question God's chosen leader, or if you say it's just, incredible short-sightedness that they didn't learn the lesson. Either way, I think that the Lord is showing here a typical attitude from the people during this wandering period. Francis?
It's mentioned that they were ungrateful to where God had given them the specific instructions on what to do, but yet they wanted to take what God wanted Moses and Aaron to do besides what they were given.
That's right, because Korah is a Levite, he's a Kohathite, and he had been given some work to do. Sam?
So in verse 14, they blame Moses for removing them from their promised land. They say, you brought us up out of this land flowing with milk and honey, as if they don't even realize why they're out there wandering.
Isn't that terrible? The Lord had described the promised land as a land flowing with milk and honey. They had seen that from the spies' report, that it was a land flowing with milk and honey. But then they're upset because Moses had taken them from, and they call it a land flowing with milk and honey. Egypt, the place of bondage, now looks as good as the way the promised land had been described. And just that kind of just blasphemous, slanderous talk. You've brought us out of a land flowing with milk and honey to have us die in the wilderness, and you would lord it over us. You just want to be the boss.
Are they talking about Egypt right there? Or is it Canaan? I guess.
It seems like Egypt to me. Does anyone see that differently? Is it not enough that you have brought us up out of a land flowing with milk and honey? They never went into the land.
Did you have us die in the wilderness? I assumed that like, well, you turned us around, we were right there, and now you're bringing us up here to die. That's what I thought.
Possible. But they never were in there. They never enjoyed the fruit of the land. So to me, it read like they're referring to Egypt there again. We know they're going to mention that many other times where they talk about all the good stuff we had back in Egypt, the cucumbers and the leeks and everything else that they enjoyed.
Is the term milk and honey ever used again to describe Egypt?
I don't know.
I figured that was always just for Canaan.
Isn't verse 13, Egypt, 14?
Yeah, that's the way I understand it. So 13 seems to be... They're referring to Egypt as that land flowing with milk and honey. And indeed, you have not brought us into a land flowing with milk and honey where you had promised us to go. So, interesting choice of words. So, how should a Christian combat these same attitudes? How can we make application to ourselves? Remain humble.
And meek, seek unity among God's people. With the right attitudes, Ephesians 4, 1 through 3 talks about endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace, but it talks about that humility, lowliness of mind, long-suffering, forbearance, obviously submitting to God's authority, of course Him, and then those He's placed in authority as well need to be recognized because God's placed them there.
Yeah, when God chooses a leader, we need to be humble enough to submit to that person. We'll talk about that hopefully if we have time. Parents have been given a position of leadership. And so, you hear some horror stories of kids yelling at their parents, and sometimes it's closer to home than you think, right? Just the disrespect. That's listed over in Romans 1, along with all these other terrible sins. Disobedience to parents is in that list of those things that are worthy of death. Same with, a wife to her husband, right? Who's the appointed leader in the family? The husband. It's been appointed by God. And there's many reasons why a woman might not want to respect that man, right? But he's been appointed by God. And so the same rebellious attitude can exist in a wife. Yes, he needs to be a good, godly leader. But even if he does not, right, the Bible teaches a wife to submit and follow her husband's leadership. Elders are the third that I thought of, appointed leaders by God. And so we ought not to rebel. I wanted to look at that word rebellion because it is mentioned many times in our New Testaments. Maybe you can think of a few places. That Greek word antilego, lego is that form of the word logos, which is word, right? We know logos is the word. Anti-legos, it's a word against. And so it's the idea of, I'm going to contradict what that person is saying. I'm going to oppose that person. The King James word in all of these places with Korah and elsewhere is the word gainsayers. And that maybe in our English, the word gainsayer isn't very clear. You think maybe they're saying something for personal gain, but that's not the idea. It's that word, it's where we get the word against. You see the word gain in there? It's against saying. I'm saying something against somebody else. There's a passage in Timothy that talks about servants and masters. It's the idea of answering again. We don't have servants anymore, certainly don't have slaves, but the idea of authority, and you go tell your servant to go do something, you don't expect them to talk back, right? And say, no, I don't think so. Same with your kids. They're probably the closest thing to it, right? I need you to go make your bed. No, I don't want to. Who are you to answer back to me? I'm your father. Go do what I said. That's the idea. That's the rebellion that's under discussion here, is the answering back. And you see that's exactly what Korah, Dathan, and Abiram were doing. They're answering back to Moses and Aaron, who are simply doing what God told them to do. Here's a couple of examples. Romans 10:21, talking about Israel. But to Israel he saith, all day long I have stretched forth my hands unto a disobedient and gainsaying people. That's King James, New American Standard. All the day long I've stretched out my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people. That's the same word there, this idea of rebellion. This is the passage I mentioned on slaves. Urge bond slaves to be subject to their own masters in everything, to be well-pleasing, not argumentative, New American Standard, or the idea of answering again. So a slave isn't to be argumentative. Why do I have to do that? Why do I have to do it that way? Maybe we have that in our marriages, right? If you're asked to do something, you should do it, and do it the way they want it to be done, right? Not answering again, or you're going to end up being argumentative, which we shouldn't be. Other places, can you think of other places where the New Testament talks about rebellion? Does anything come to mind? One was in the context of the eldership. Of course, there's the children's requirements for an elder that they would not be accused of riot or rebellion. That's actually a slightly different word. But there's another expectation of the elders in Titus 1:9 that this is in the context of what the overseer's requirements are, that they are holding fast the faithful word, which is in accordance with the teaching, so that he will be able both to exhort in sound doctrine and to refute those who contradict. Or in the King James, it was able to convince the gainsayers. So there's going to be gainsayers in this day, right? There's going to be plenty of people who want to speak against the truth. And an elder, and therefore all of us as Christians who are trying to grow to maturity, should be trying to grow to the point where we can convince a gainsayer of their error. So there will be gainsayers that need to be convinced of their error. Well, for sake of time, I'll skip past this. Was there a comment? Go ahead, April.
Relationship to the government, Romans 13:2, therefore whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God.
Yeah. Right. Those are appointed leaders as well. We've got to submit to them. All right, let's move on if we can, unless there's any other comments. I want to talk about this rebellion a little bit more from the idea of what these men had been given to do. I think Francis mentioned that. What duties were given to the Kohathites?
To transport the the furniture, holy items and stuff of the tabernacle after, obviously, the restrictions were they couldn't wrap it up and touch them.
Yeah, very specific. What was their limitation? What would cause their death in the process of transporting the furniture? Francis?
Well, they weren't supposed to touch it, right? So
They had poles inserted, but they were also not supposed to see it.
And watch while the holy things were being covered.
right.
Aaron and his sons did that. It was interesting to read that process. You know, they take down the veil, which keeps you from seeing the Ark of the Covenant. They take down that veil and they put it right on the Ark. So even they're not, you could imagine being able to do that without even looking at it yourself. Just showing ultimate respect for that symbol and representation of Jehovah. And so these Kohathites, though, they were the ones who carried it. Is that a privilege? Yeah, you are close to these items that represent God. And there are 11 other tribes, 12 if you count the 2 from Joseph, that don't get that privilege. And there's even families within the Levites who don't get that privilege. So they had a special job. This question 6, I hope you didn't wrestle with it too long because I asked it really poorly. What do you notice about Moses and Aaron's family? What family are they from?
Kohath.
They're also Kohathites.
Right? The family tree of Levi, just to kind of understand how far we've come from Joseph and his brothers, right? So Levi, one of Joseph's brothers that went down into Egypt, he had Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. And Kohath had, one of his sons was Amram. So Amram's the father of Aaron and Moses. His second son listed was Izhar, and the first of his sons that was listed was Korah. So what's Korah's relationship to Moses and Aaron? They're first cousins. What's that kind of suggest might be behind some of this rebellion?
You might see some jealousy, right? And we saw
You could see jealousy in their words, but you can also see what might cause some of that jealousy to spring up. Who are you? You're no better than me. We're from the same family. We're from, we got the same pedigree. This is so close to Levi in that sense. And so I asked, where might you have seen that theme elsewhere in the Bible? But if you didn't know this was where I was going, that question probably didn't make any sense. So I apologize for that. But where have you seen that kind of family rivalry already? Right. Joseph, they were all jealous of Joseph and how he'd been chosen, maybe with a little bit of Jacob and Esau, right? So it's a recurring theme in the Bible that being close family relationships can also lead to jealousy. Now, fast forward to Christ, you might think, well, okay, I haven't seen my brother in a while. I don't know. I'm not really jealous of him. No, God makes all of us brothers and sisters, so we're the family. And can jealousy arise within a family? Absolutely. So we've got to be careful not to let that spring up. Psalm 84 is such a beautiful lesson to me, and I also had an error where I referenced Numbers 16:6, and I meant to reference Numbers 16:9. But we don't have time to go read all of Psalm 84, but what attitudes do you see? So Korah's sons survived this event. And it's very explicit, but over in Numbers 26, it says, the sons of Korah did not die. Dathan and Abiram and their whole families, their sons, they all are swallowed up when God punishes them. But the sons of Korah did not die. Sons of Korah become very prominent psalm writers. They write 11 of our psalms. So they were singers, as we see also in the text. So I wanted you to look at Psalm 84 because it's a beautiful psalm written by Korah's sons. What attitudes did you see in Psalm 84? If you want to flip over there, we may probably run out of time on this topic. Sam?
Humility in their faith in God, and how highly they speak of the blessings that are received by those who dwell in this house.
right.
They seem very content, right? What do they say about dwelling in his courts? Look over at Psalm 84 if you're not there. A day in your courts, verse 10, a day in your courts is better than 1,000 outside. I would rather stand at the threshold of the house of my God than dwell in the tents of wickedness. Such a great verse, great one to commit to memory. So the sons of Korah, Moses, when he responds to the rebels, he says back in Numbers 16, is it not enough for you? That was Numbers 16:9. Is it not enough for you that you've been chosen to do this work before God? And apparently it wasn't. It wasn't enough. But here the sons of Korah have learned that lesson, and they're saying, just standing at the threshold. Norm and Jason are demonstrating that task this morning. We've got guys who just stand at the doorway, and they're making sure everybody can come in, making sure the door's locked at the right times and unlocked at the right times. And interestingly enough, that was one of the jobs given to the sons of Korah, specifically after they get into the promised land. So 1 Chronicles 9:19, if you want to check that, the Korahites were keepers of the thresholds. Obviously, when you have the job of carrying the furniture, and now the furniture is in its permanent resting place, you're available to do a different job. So they were keepers of the thresholds, or the entrance. And so they write this psalm and they say, I would rather stand at the threshold, which is probably not a very big job, right? Smaller than the high priest, no doubt. But I'd rather stand there than in the tents of wickedness. What a wonderful lesson for us. Just contentment with our jobs. Sam?
Semi off topic. It says that the ground swallowed them up and they fell alive in a Sheol. What does that mean?
Well, first of all, what's Sheol?
At the midpoint, I guess, right? Is that what we call
I think it has a spiritual meaning in the sense of Hades and this realm of the dead, but it was also used by the Hebrews to describe the place where the dead go, which is the grave. So they descended into their graves alive, right? So they fell into the earth. The ground opened up. I think Penny prepared a little demonstration for the girls downstairs, so I don't have anything to show how the people fell into the earth. But Moses said, if the Lord does something entirely new, then you know that this was something chosen by God. And he did something entirely new. He opened up the earth, and they fell in alive. And it was a gruesome punishment. We didn't get to question 8, the actions that God took. You also have then the next day, what does the congregation foolishly do? No, not the incense. The next day, the entire congregation gathers against Moses and Aaron again, blaming them for the death of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. And God sends a plague. It's one of the scariest moments, I think, in the scriptures where, God had previously said, I'm going to wipe them all out, and there was time for Moses to say, no, please don't, and God doesn't. But this time, God just starts. He's so frustrated with this people. They've tested him over 10 times, and now he just sends the plague. And 14,700 people die before Aaron checks it with his censer. All right, we'll see if we want to touch on a couple of these last questions before we start into lesson 2 next week, but got a lot more to cover there as well. Thank you, everyone.